for the cross. I appreciate it. So actually, why don't you jump in, because I want to say publicly words of gratitude to our reopening task force, which is led by our immediate past moderator, Ann Olson, but you've been our staff representative, and you all met Monday, right? Day before yesterday. At my request, but also at our lay leadership's request, to look at if we can add any seats safely. Our current capacity, we're saying, is 100. And so can you update us on that, please?
Sure. And that shows what good friends we are, that I feel comfortable to interrupt you.
No, please. Well, thank you for that, because anyone should always feel that comfortable. But yes, thank you.
Yes, I'm happy to share. The task force on reopening met because we were aware, and the clergy were especially aware last week, how quickly the 100 seats that we had allocated for each service were gone, and that people who wanted to worship with us in person weren't able to. And the task force looked at a number of things. It was really important to us to maintain the safety guidelines, the distance, et cetera. But we did decide that we believe it's safe, and we opened the balcony, which opens up quite a few more seats. And you will see when you are here that we have placed some chairs at the extreme edges, the corners of the wings, if you will.
Yeah, I call them the triangles. They're corners and back corners.
Safe distance from others. But the good news is that means, even though this is Wednesday at 5 o'clock, there are still seats for all 3 services on Sunday. There are more services still available at 8 o'clock, but there are a good number of seats still open for both the 9:30 and the 11 o'clock service. And we're thrilled that means there are more people who will be able to come and worship in person and hear our candidate, Angela Wells-Bean. That we're just all excited that she's here, and I'm excited that more people can hear her. So.
Yeah, well, and actually, that was a great sequitur, because I was also going to express that, it's so interesting how in the life of the church, how it so often reflects, kind of the life cycle. That's probably a really that as we grieve your departure, as you retire, we also celebrate new beginnings. And so we were actually just commenting that we know that Angela and her spouse Andy and their 2 kids have landed safely here in Naples, promising them beautiful weather on the rainiest day probably of 2021 so far.
But tomorrow it's going to be beautiful.
That's what everyone's promised, and that's what I text messaged them before I came. But again, people are invited to the virtual reception on Friday and the in-person reception on Saturday. And again, we look forward to not only her preaching, but the called congregational meeting to vote on her candidacy on Sunday. So it's going to be a fun rather busy week and weekend. But again, I'm just always struck how really those healthy transitions can happen when we welcome candidates in the midst of the life of the church. Any other announcements I was thinking of? Obviously, we'll be here next week, same bat time, same bat channel, all that good stuff. Well, let's dive in, because I was really struck by these two chapters. Obviously, if you were at the 9 o'clock service or watched the 9 o'clock service, you watched me talk about how this is one of my favorite books, and then completely blank on the title in front of the congregation. But other than that, this book is really, I'm listening to it on Audible, as I often do when they're available, and he reads the book. Bishop Curry reads the book, which I always enjoy. But I just have really found some of his insights, especially his use of poetry and spirituals, particularly poetry in what I would call the traditional black, or the black tradition, Harlem poets. I would be candid to say poets that I'm not as necessarily familiar with, and it's opened my eyes to some poets that I'm eager to do some more reading of. So again, and I think he does a lot of that in chapter 3, which begins on page 50 and is entitled Making Do and Making New. And he works to answer the question, how do I find the energy to keep loving when the world seems to be going the other way? And I remember when, again, I'm listening to it, but I keep a hard copy for reference purposes. And I thought to myself, okay, so this could not be more perfect for not only the time we're living in, but of course, literally the week that we're living in. I think about, the Chauvin trial. The verdict was handed down yesterday. I'm confident there are people who have a lot of strong feelings about that. And so I just thought, wow, this is such the perfect chapter for this week. And then he offers this really wonderful quote from Nora Neale Hurston from her work, Dust Tracks on a Road. I have been in sorrow's kitchen and licked out all the pots. Then I have stood on the peaky mountain wrapped in rainbows with a hard and sword in my hand. And I just thought, I loved that image of I've been in sorrow's kitchen and licked out all the pots. So he begins the chapter talking about his grandmother's kitchen, and he provides, I think, such a vivid image of his grandmother's Formica table, and watching her, he calls it work, but really doing cooking. And he writes on page 54, if grandma's cooking was, quote, making do, then we know what making do really means. It means making grits, taking grits and making them gourmet. It means creating a meal for your family that tastes like love feels.
I love that.
Well, that was the thing, was like my mind just immediately went to that place in my mind, both of meals prepared and meals eaten. And I just wondered if that brought up images for you.
Oh, yeah.
And that you might share.
When I was a child, I come from a very large Catholic family.
That's right, because you're one of 4.
I'm one of 5 kids.
5. I always
and
do
then
get that wrong. Yeah, you're the oldest. Yeah.
My mother had 3 siblings, and one had 10 kids, and one had 4 kids, and 5 kids. So we had big family gatherings at Easter. And you may know that my aunt and uncle lived on a winery and had a winery. And so every Easter, all my maternal cousins, and there were, I would say, there were more than 100 of us gathered for Easter, and they would put a lamb on the spit, and everybody would bring food. The children would be running around the creek. We'd play hide and seek in the vineyards. Sometimes we'd get a little bit of wine when we were kids. My uncle would sing Santa Lucia, and it was just like this amazing celebration of love and family and food, and that, tastes like love feels.
Yeah.
It was just an amazing time in my childhood.
I was going to say, I can just transport myself there. I can totally see that. Sure, do you have?
It's funny because thinking about your question, I found myself going in a whole bunch of different directions. I think because he talks about his grandmother's kitchen, it did take me back to being a child and visiting my grandparents. We lived in Maryland but both sets of my grandparents were in Missouri, so it was a big trip usually once a year, occasionally twice a year. And my mother's parents lived at very modest means, but I just remember meals with them that were not fancy, very simple, but plentiful. I mean, there was always far too much food. And then I also remember my father's parents later lived down in the Ozark Mountains, and the farmhouse, and it was an old farmhouse. So I thought about those family meals. But then I also thought about my nuclear family, and what came to my mind, because it did, was this one restaurant that was our special place to go for special family meals. And it was called Peter Pan. It was about 30 minutes away from us in a very rural area. But it was served family style. And I recently I don't know why it came up, but I was talking to my parents, and it must have been on a Zoom call with my brothers, because we were remembering, like, fried chicken was one of the big things, but they also had these very delicious corn fritters. I mean, but that was our special place to go for special occasions.
Yeah.
And so those things came to mind. And now, it's a different stage of life entirely. It's whenever we could get both of our kids and their families together. And that's difficult, but.
Yeah. I was thinking about what I call the smell memory. Like sometimes I'll come across a smell, and there's just certain aromas, and it can take me back to family meals. It can take me back, like, to a table growing up, or I wasn't overly close to grandparents growing up, and so for me it's always been about family relationships that have been created. But I also thought, I thought too about when I moved to Florida over 7 years ago, one of the great, I would say, anxieties that I had was about holidays away from family. Although I'm very fortunate that I get to go back and spend many holidays with my nuclear family. But I just think about how I've been able to create those experiences here. And how different they are, but how special they've become. So I've spent holidays on the beach. I've spent holidays with your family. And I just think about how we create those traditions in a different way, and how love lives itself out in so many different ways, both in how we envision and plan it, and then sometimes how I think God works God's ways in our lives. And to me, that's a gift. And I just think of both of you who have created such hospitality for me in my life. And I know I can go to your homes and have just easy dinners. Like, they're always good, but they're always just easy.
But they're easy to make too, in my house.
Well, I appreciate that. They're real easy for me to make. I never do anything.
But the other thing that brought to mind is, and I think about this a lot, because my parents up and moved from Missouri without anybody, and we didn't have family for the first 10 years that we were there, and then we just had one sibling and cousins. The church really functioned as my extended family. And those were my aunts and uncles and mothers and fathers in the faith. And we had a regular tradition of potluck suppers. So, and it was a small church, so everybody knew everybody. And, I can picture still the room with linoleum floors and the tables covered with lots of good food.
Yeah. Well, you bring up church, and actually that was another thing. And interestingly, Bishop Curry doesn't go into this in great detail. He kind of alludes to it, but I just kept thinking about his image of, I loved this, about it means creating a meal for your family that tastes like love feels. And, I did some of my doctoral work on how communion is a reconciliation for, and can be used as a reconciliation tool for churches. And I just think in congregations, and I think about how that is such a powerful image for me about the act of the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper, communion. I know we've had some rich conversations as a team about, especially with our varied backgrounds, coming from a Catholic tradition, coming from a Baptist tradition, a Methodist tradition, and bringing all of that diversity and knowing that that represents the diversity of our congregation as well, about what communion, the Lord's Supper, Eucharist means when we prepare it, when we consecrate it to be used and celebrated in the midst of a congregation. And I know that that's actually something that we really struggled with during the pandemic, is how do we help people honor that and celebrate that while apart? Because I see the communion table as one large celebration of creating a meal that tastes like love feels. And that may be a rather simplistic look at it, or depending on how you want to look at it. But I just wondered if there were theological thoughts that you had about that, just because I know we've had some rich conversations around communion and the Eucharist.
Well, and I always liked using the terminology of Lord's Supper, because supper feels very family-like.
Right.
And my favorite service growing up was Maundy Thursday. This was not a big church. We didn't have pews. And when I was growing up, they did later. But we had folding chairs. And
I think you've shared that before, but I didn't remember that. Okay, sorry.
So Maundy Thursday, they'd put the communion table in the middle of the sanctuary and then do folding chairs around so that you really felt like you were gathered around the table. And I also think, who knows all of the ways that God called me into ministry through church experiences then and later, but the youth were also very involved, and we had Youth Sunday sermon, a Youth Sunday when a youth would do the sermon. And somehow, we also got involved in communion sometimes. Like, I have this really strange memory. We would try different things. The normal bread was matzah, but we would try different things. I don't know why we were so creative in the 1960s, but one time...
We'll explain it later, Sharon.
One time, we tried vanilla wafers. And I will tell you, they're very crunchy. So that you're sitting next to somebody and it's really loud. I would not recommend it. But I just have fond feelings about gathering for supper, for the Lord's Supper as a church family.
I just love that image, though, of the communion table down the center of the sanctuary. That's just so powerful.
I have this memory of, there's this particular retreat community that I've been a part of over the years, and there's this one element, they serve communion every day during the retreat, and there's this one moment where everyone comes forward and takes a piece of the bread and names what they want to let go of. And they put it in the basket. And you go back to your seats. And then you go back and you take somebody else's burden and take it.
Interesting.
And for me, it's such a powerful symbol of the body of Christ, because we're bearing each other's burdens. We're helping each other let go of whatever it is, whether it was fear or some lingering sin or whatever it was that they needed to let go of. And it was a profound sense of feeling of being the body of Christ. So.
Yeah.
How about you?
I would say, wow, I've participated in that same retreat, and I'd forgotten about that, and that is so powerful. I just, the church that I came from served communion every Sunday. And, you might think that might get old at some point, and as a clergy person, and things. And I just was always struck that it never got tiresome or laborious. And there was just profound joy. And in that context, where so many had been denied communion, you could really, and that was one of the values about why they serve it each Sunday, there was so much joy around receiving communion, and you could sense that profound joy every time, and it was really palatable every time, and I remember thinking, this never gets old, and so there was, the idea of liberation theology was really lived out through communion, and that was something I had not experienced firsthand until not only serving that church, but I actually had attended that church for a little while on a Wednesday night during seminary before I served it. So it was powerful both to experience it firsthand and then to serve that congregation. So that was it was a really powerful experience.
We have talked at different times in context of different books about the ways that the church has historically hurt people, and denying communion is one of the most awful things that I can fathom.
Yeah, and it's interesting how during an evening with your pastors, people still share stories about how profoundly painful that can be. Not to be that person or anything, but particularly from the Catholic tradition, where those who are divorced or have been denied for whatever reason, that's a profoundly painful experience. And I we still, I can think of someone just last fall who shared that profound pain, and I think, I think about how as clergy, I know one of the things we've talked about is how can we empower those experiences of grace and not hinder people from them. And again, I think Bishop Curry's ministry is really all about that. On page 55, again, still in chapter 3, he writes, "Making do is not the same as giving up or giving in to the status quo. It's a way of figuring out how to both survive and thrive." And again, I couldn't hear that or reread it and not think about the last 13 months that we've been through. And how this has been for many of us a time of making do, but it's been making do for our church, for our world, for our families. Have you experienced that personally? We've experienced it corporately. How do you think you've seen people, either firsthand or just in general observations of making do?
Well, let me just say that if I'm being completely honest, it is absolutely exhausting.
Sure.
Just exhausting. And trying to make something out of this making do, like they were talking about it, takes a lot of determination and perseverance. And this afternoon I had some time, and I just went out and walked the labyrinth. I was telling Sharon this beforehand, and as I'm walking it, there's little short periods and then there's long periods. So what came to mind is something Eugene Peterson once said, and he said, "The Christian life is a long obedience in one direction." And that's kind of what this feels like. So in the long stretches, I'm thinking, this is that long obedience in one direction during this pandemic. And the short ones were, that's just for today, God. I can do a short obedience in one direction. But I do think that for me, it's a spiritual practice. I have only gotten through this pandemic by seeing it as a spiritual practice and trying to make sense out of it, to reframe it, to understand what God's teaching me, to recognize my impatience and my irritability, and all of that is ways of forming my character in Christ.
What a powerful image. One of the things I also love about the pattern of our labyrinth, which I know has a name and it's slipping me, but the Chartres pattern, is that the point at which you believe you are furthest from the center, you are actually about to make the turn to be the closest. And I always think about that, and Lauren Artress and others have written about how that's such the perfect image about the heart of God. How sometimes when we feel furthest from God, we're actually the closest because God is holding us so close. And so I think the combination of those two images can really carry us through those. You know, and Curry writes so, I believe, so eloquently about the midnight of the soul, you know, because he carries that from the slave spirituality of slaves, which I think he just does with such eloquence. And so that really resonates, talking about that image. What about for you, Sharon?
Well, yes, and I thought about it more corporately, but that's actually one of my favorite quotes because I think he takes this idea of giving up, or when he's talking about making do, he says it's not giving up. And I think it's just so important to say that figuring out how to live through it and how to make something new. I mean, that I thought the juxtaposition of making do and making new, figuring out how to get through this and make something new out of it is not giving up. Because it would be easy to not only give up, but to just think that you're just giving up because you can't change it. But basically, I think he's saying that with God's help, we can change it. We can make something new. And some of the things that came to mind were some of the good things that we as a church have made out of this, including Clergy Roundtable, or our going the distance, and some of the things that emerged out of the necessity, but have really been not just surviving, but thriving. But I do want to say, when I was rereading for tonight, the chapter and when he talks about midnight being that moment when it can go either way,
Right.
I could not think about yesterday as I sat and watched for the verdict because it really felt like it could go either way. And his talking about midnight and the promise of a new dawn, it certainly spoke to this moment, as you said.
Yeah. I think that I've always been familiar with the term dark night of the soul, but again, when Curry brings this image about the midnight, again, as you point out, Sharon, where he talks, it can go either way, and he uses the image, and we'll talk about it in a second, where Tutu talks about where the midnight of South Africa, where apartheid could have really permanently taken hold, or where it was defeated, and the midnight where the civil rights movement. I mean, again, he just uses these images, I think, in such a powerful way that have helped reframe some things for me. I was just doing a time check. I'm going to skip over this little bit here and jump on to chapter 4, because it too is a very, very rich chapter. You probably see in our notes here that the title of chapter 4 is a chapter title dream come true for me. It is What Desmond Tutu and Dolly Parton Have in Common, two icons of mine. For those who don't know, Dolly Parton is almost has a cult following in the LGBTQ community. And Desmond Tutu is a spiritual hero of mine. Chapter 4 begins on page 71 and attempts to answer the question, can love really change the world? And we really talk a lot about dreams in this chapter. And he quotes from Dolly Parton's book, Dream More. Since my early childhood, I have felt like my dreams were the foundation of my drive to accomplish all the things I love. It was a dream that made me feel dressed up when I just had my old hand-me-down ragged clothes. Dreams took me from a shack at the foothills of the Great Smoky Mountains to Nashville and then to Hollywood. And then he goes on to write on page 71. And yet, dreaming, like love, is a language that people easily dismiss. Dreams are fanciful, ethereal, naive, or even a setup for failure, or maybe not. Do you think our culture is dismissive of dreams?
Yes and no.
Yeah.
The yes part is, well, I think when we think of dreams, we just individualize it, and we think about my dreams, and I don't remember dreams, or somebody, and some people find great meaning in their dreams, and other people just want to dismiss even the idea that there could be power in that. the dreams that we're missing, I don't know if dismissive is the right word, but I think we're missing right now the leaders who can, the prophets,
Yeah.
who can put forth
Yeah.
the dream for who we can be as a people.
Yeah.
And so
Who can
those
cast
are
that
those are
dream.
really
Yeah.
different understandings of dreams.
I really appreciate that. I think that's really powerful. Because, like, I think about, I just had this really goofy dream last night during my sleep that, I mean, I'm sure a psychiatrist would have a field day with, but it's really, I think, like, I can unpack it pretty easily and kind of understand what it's about, especially after, when you have a dream that has alligators in it after a 2.5-hour executive committee meeting, like, I think it's a pretty clear, like, I don't think it's a stretch. But at the same, so I can, like, be dismissive of dreams like that, but then I think about how, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke about dreams and how it has shaped our nation. Yeah. And so I think what you're saying echoes with me, Sharon, and
it's culturally, it's also, somebody can have a dream in a congregation to do something that's amazing. I love getting swept up in dreams. I am a dreamer. I love it. I look for leaders who are going to make me dream. Mm-hmm. Some people don't, and I understand that, and I think those are people who tend to be more pragmatic. I tend to be a possibility person, and so I love it. And I still remember, and I'm sure you guys could come up with dreamers in your congregation, but I served a little tiny church in Mayview, Missouri, and they had a basement where all the children were in Sunday school, and it was leaking, and it was musty, and it was no place to teach children. But they were farmers. They didn't have a lot of money. So Ella Mae Hain, at 87, I think, decided she had a dream to build a building for our children and the community to have Sunday school. And she said it in church one Sunday, and everyone's like, "Oh, May, there's no way we can raise that money." She said, "Yes, we can." And she put down the seed money, and she made it happen, and we built that. And I just think about, it only takes somebody who's got passion.
Yep.
And it could be in a church, it could be in our community, it could be in our nation. We can do this. So
Yeah.
I get excited about that.
No, I appreciate that. And again, I think, Sharon, I think you raised such a vital point of where are and who are the leaders in our nation, our churches, our schools, our civic organizations who are casting the dreams, right, who are able and willing and courageous enough to step out and say, here's the dream, here's the vision, and here's how we can get there, and inspire people.
And I do think there's a difference between a dream and a vision.
Okay, say more.
And I want to say, I think a dream feels like it's more of a metaphor for people to hang on to. A vision is more nuts and bolts in my mind, the way I've seen it. I think we need dreamers. I think we've got a lot of visionaries who've got ideas that they want to put into place, but I think dreaming is a bigger concept for me. And it's why people like Martin Luther King Jr. and Desmond Tutu, because they used metaphors to help us catch that vision that made us see beyond. And it usually, I think dreams have a spiritual component.
Yeah.
So they catch us, not just our mind, but our body and our spirit and our emotions as well.
So I really appreciate that. That's a great insight. And what I hear you saying is that a dream can be all-encompassing.
I think it is.
Yeah.
And I've never thought about that difference,
Yeah.
and I need to give some more thought to.
We could have rebuttal time next week.
No,
if you
it's
just-
not,
I'm just kidding.
I just want to explore it.
Yeah, no.
But and maybe you're going to go on there. I mean, I think part of what he points us to, that for Christians, is what's God's dream.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and actually, I do want to have a quick side note to say, Desmond Tutu authored a really fantastic book that is entitled "God Has a Dream for You, A Vision of Hope for Our Time." And it's absolutely one of my favorite books. Easy read, not very long, and not a new book. It's I think it was published in like around 2000 or something like that. But it is just an extraordinary book where I believe, one of the things he's trying to do is call out in us really what Tutu sees as the goodness that God has created and put into each of us, and really trying to call that out. It's just something
I'll look at it.
I would raise up, and especially that dream language.
I want to say something about older people who dream.
Yeah,
Because I think,
it's biblical.
yeah, and I think that we usually see young people as dreamers. And I'm always struck by people, our wise elders, who still dream dreams for us.
Yeah.
Because I think that takes so much hope and optimism after probably seeing many dreams beat down. And so I think in a congregation this age, to see dreamers, wow, it really excites me.
And I think there are some. And
I
I
do
think
too.
who've made
Undoubtedly.
their dreams come true.
Yeah,
Who've-
or have made dreams for the community come true.
Yeah.
Like, they've invested their lives in things that really matter. I mean, I could go through all the people. I work with the Board of Mission Outreach, and some of the people on that in our congregation, the dreams that they have made come to pass
Well, yeah.
to improve people's lives are significant.
Absolutely.
And I was just thinking too about some of the things I think specifically about BOMO and our Board of Mission Outreach and others is, and perhaps this is where the spiritual maturity that sometimes comes with age, is it the patience that it takes to see some of those dreams come true? Because, when you're working on trying to change systems or change lives, it just takes a lot of patience.
And maybe that's what the maturity of age can do.
Yeah.
Maybe our young ones are dreaming dreams, but our old ones might be the ones who give the nuts and bolts to make them happen.
Yeah.
Well, and if you're fortunate enough to live to that wiser old age, then there are the resources of time and experience, not just that you've lived a long time, but that you have time. And I think sometimes young people's lives are very, very busy with raising a family or trying to get by in the world. And what I really appreciate is when that's how they want to use the time they have and the gifts they have,
Right.
is for others.
And
Well,
we have a lot of those.
Yeah,
A lot.
and again, Bishop Curry writes about unselfish living. And, I think he gives great eloquence to how we live lives that aren't, you don't just turn over your life and become a doormat, but that, you live in ways that empower others and make the world a better place. And I think those are really connected. He goes on to write in chapter 4, the language of a dream is the language of hope. And I think that's connected. And then he writes, dreaming, impractical, foolish, impossible dreaming gave us the very real civil rights movement. Dreaming gave us a South Africa freed from apartheid. Dreaming, as I see it, has saved me and many others from turning to despair and destruction in the darkest days when evil seems to be winning. Again, that's that midnight reference that we were talking about earlier. Dreams are love's visions. I love this imagery. God, I love this imagery. Dreams are love's visions, the boundless faith that the world can be remade to look more like what God hoped for God's creation. How do dreams work for you in your spiritual life, or do they? I mean, do they guide any part of your spiritual life?
They do, actually, but not sleeping dreams.
Okay.
My husband majors in those.
Yeah.
He actually does, he analyzes his dreams almost every day. He thinks about them and what they might mean. But for me, whenever I have embarked on a new adventure, it's usually a dream, and it's almost always, for me, come out of a time of silent reflection. Dreams always come up for me, from that, I have to kind of make space for dreams to rise up, and so I can begin something new. So, I mean, one of the things I'm really looking forward to post-retirement is I'm taking a sabbatical of my mind, so that I can kind of figure out what that next dream is for God. I mean, that God has for me in this next chapter. And I'm making space for the silence so the dream can emerge.
Could it also be said like this? If you're too busy and the things around you are too noisy, there's not the spiritual space to dream.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's my issue.
No, but I believe, I don't think that's exclusively for you. I mean, I think that's for me. I think that's applicable to me, and I think applicable to others. So you once again have taught me something to be mindful of. What about for you?
I came at it a different way because it affects me in a different way. There's somewhere in the book, I think before this, but maybe after this, where I'm going to say Tutu because we've been talking about Tutu, but Bishop Curry talks about God was just assumed. I mean, there was just an assumption.
Yeah.
God is, and that wasn't something you questioned. And for me, the idea that God is and that God has a dream for us that is better than present reality is such a fundamental assumption that the question in the beginning about how do we get through times like these, I can only do it because of a foundational faith that this is not what God intends, that God is and that God dreams and wants something very different for us. So that gives me direction and purpose in terms of what I do with my life, but it also just keeps me from utter despair when things are completely falling apart.
Yeah. Again, I just think I can't raise and think about these kinds of questions without thinking about the last 13 months, without thinking about yesterday. I mean, just, again, I posted on my social media last week when we were starting this book about, we chose this book, I don't know, 2 months ago, I think. And I just think about the poignancy of how it just fits so perfectly into where we are as a country and frankly, where I find myself individually and corporately as a team and as a congregation. And so I just was really struck by what you were saying about how we kind of waited yesterday in that time. I often find that, and this is probably as mystical as I get, but David and I would talk about this some when we were still working together, is I find that sometimes God whispers to me in my dreams. And that might sound a little woogie for some people, but, because, I'm never as quiet as I am when I'm sleeping, and so I think that sometimes I work things out in my dreams. And I also know where my stress points are in my dreams often. Like if it shows up in a dream, I know it's really bugging me. And so I've learned, and this is a recent lesson in the last couple of years, I've really learned to pay attention to what shows up in my dreams, because that's a way that God can sometimes rattle me when God needs to.
That's very biblical.
Yes, and it actually came from some spiritual work that I was doing that I thought, God has a long history of
talking to dreams.
Yeah, exactly,
dreams.
Exactly. Yeah. Bishop Curry brings up Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who I am a huge fan of her work. And she authored the seminal work on death and grieving in a book entitled On Death and Dying, where she shared what she had learned from terminally ill patients. And so I entered seminary in 2004, and this was still a text that we read. And so she describes denial, avoidance, bargaining, negotiating with God that often people who are end of life do, but also she talks about that the help with family, friends, that people often can turn to prayer, meditation, and find peace with not only the dying process, but with God. And, Bishop Curry speaks very eloquently of his experiences as a pastor. It resonated with my journeys as a pastor with people at end of life. But the two of you really do the lion's share of pastoral care for us.
Deb.
But I just was curious if this resonated with you in your experiences.
Well, I want to add one more
Please.
piece to Dr. Kubler-Ross's work. Before she died, she was working in the 6th stage. Have you heard about that?
I have, but I don't remember it. Refresh, please.
It's making meaning.
That's right, yeah.
So the 6th stage is
Yeah.
after
Thank you.
acceptance, meaning making.
Yeah.
And I think that's really, really important because
Was it meaning making of that process or meaning making of one's life?
it could be either.
Either,
Because
okay.
if you think about, the stages of, I can't even remember who it was, life cycle.
Erickson's
Yeah, generativity. That generativity is that
versus
the,
stagnation.
yeah, and so there's that, and then there's
Right.
life review is really important at the end of life.
Yeah.
To
Right, yeah.
legacy. What is your legacy? What is
Yeah.
the life review? So I do think meaning making is really important, and I can't tell you how important these two things are at the end of life. Number one, having a support system, a family or friends who will be there to the very end. And number two, a deep faith. Because either one will help you get to the end of life in peace, but the two of them together can almost guarantee it. And so when I see people at the end of life with their faith and support system around them, they're making the transition well.
Yeah. That is profound, and I just think about, I'm just reflecting on people that I've been on that journey with, and I think about the amount of work that's needed from me as a pastor, and for people that have those things, I just kind of show up.
I was just going to say, the joke is, I had this guy come to me for counseling because he was really scared of death, and he said, I'm just getting ready for my final exams.
Yeah.
And I just thought that was so cute because he still hadn't made sense out of death and eternal life for himself. Mm-hmm. And so, you talk about those things, about what are your deepest beliefs? What do you not know? What can you be okay with? The mystery of.
Yeah. And that's that meaning making. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I don't have anything to add in terms of that. I have some frustration because runs across whenever somebody takes something like that and tries to make it prescriptive, or to say, well, then you're in this stage, or you're doing that. I mean, I think any of those kinds of things, including Erickson, can be misused, but obviously it's seminal because it was so valuable for
It
everyone.
describes where one might be in the grieving process.
Right.
And, everybody who's come since would say it's a more circular process than that. Mm-hmm. It's not linear.
Yeah, and I always express to people, about the time you think you've made it, quote, through it, you nosedive right back.
Yeah.
Or you'll make it, you think you've made it into, quote, the next step, and then you just kind of,
Yeah.
well, again, I can use I statements there, but,
Yeah.
so I want to jump down because he raises toward the end of this chapter something that I think is really an important and sometimes taboo subject. Well, let's be honest, there's lots of taboo subjects in the church. But Bishop Curry talks about processing anger and making peace. And that's part how he connects Kubler-Ross into some of this in the latter part of this chapter. And he writes, I believe, very eloquently about anger at God. And I've often found, I don't know if this is your experience, but I've often found that people have deep shame if they feel anger at God, as if, it's kind of like the sinners in the hands of an angry God. Like you will be smited if you are angry at God or express an anger at God. And I've sat with a lot of people to try to say, it's really okay. Like, God can handle it. And sometimes that's profound, and sometimes I think it's not very useful for people. But I just know that I feel like that's really taboo. And so I wanted to get to that before we conclude tonight because, again, I think people often need permission to be angry at God.
Yeah.
And so I didn't want to conclude tonight without throwing that out there for us to chew on a little bit. Experiences with that, disagreement, I mean, I can handle it. I mean,
No.
Sharon interrupts me, so it's no big no. No, I mean,
If God can handle it, he can handle it.
well, yeah, trust me, I've been accused of it thinking, but no, I mean,
No, it's interesting because what comes to my mind is one of my seminary professors, and he came to be very well known, Presbyterian pastor Thomas Troger.
oh, yeah.
Well, he started at Colgate Rochester
I was
during
because
these
I
school.
knew him at Iliff.
Well, he started at Colgate Rochester, and fresh out of a church in Utica, and literally his wife did not move with him immediately, and he lived in student housing, in the married
wow.
student housing. But he wrote a book, I think it's out of print now, but it was called Rage, Reflect, Rejoice, Praying with the Psalmists.
Yeah.
And it was really, I mean, he took the Psalms and basically said, look at how often they're raging at God. It really is okay. It's biblical to rage at God. And so I guess early on I accepted that was okay. You also had asked about, our own experiences. And I realized I don't very often that I can get angry with God because I don't think it's God doing it. I get angry at people for messing up so much. And maybe if I had a sense of God letting it happen, but I just don't think that's how God works. So it's a different question, but I certainly think that it is very biblical to rage at God.
No, I mean, the Psalms, what I think is so interesting, and I constantly find interesting about the Psalms, is it's the one place in the Bible where people speak to God and God does not answer. So it's the one place where we get to kind of let off the steam. But we also offer, on behalf of humanity, we offer praise, but it's also the one place where we speak.
Well, I can't say that I have been really angry with God, but I've been angry at what has happened in situations, especially watching children with cancer. And my sister lost 2 children to a genetic deformity. And there have been times when I've been in an angry phase, but I know, we've talked about this before. Anger is a secondary emotion. It's about the injustice of it all. It just feels not right. Something's not right with the world. And it's easy to go to God and say, God, you could have done something.
Yeah. Why did you let this happen?
Yeah, and I don't really feel that, but anger just takes over sometimes. And I remember sitting in my office and somebody came to me for counseling while I was in that space, and I was like, I don't have anything to offer. Because I just couldn't go there. So I do think, for me, when I get to the raging at the injustice of it all, it's just sadness. It's sadness and disappointment that stuff happens.
Yeah. I think the angriest I've ever been at God, but what I've really found was anger at the institution that represented God.
Right.
I.e. the church, which is often where I experience, and I often find that people experience anger. But, as has been shared in this congregation, certainly both of you who know my family well, when my father had to leave a church after I came out as a gay man publicly, that was deeply painful. And at that time, I was a pastor serving a church. And so I just had a lot of emotions flying around because, I knew my dad was okay, I knew my family was okay, and ultimately in a better place. But here I am in the institutional church that was causing this harm to my family. And so it was this really difficult thing. And so I think there were moments where I really found myself just kind of angry at God, but I totally understand and agree, and thankfully had a good therapist at the time who helped me understand that really wasn't, the anger wasn't the primary emotion. It was the sadness and the confusion and all the things that I was going through. Betrayal and those things. But that, I think, was ultimately the juxtaposition was the anger and frustration at the institution while serving the institution. That's part of the challenge of that. And so I think those are those moments. But that so often is, I think, Deb, you put it as always so eloquently, of it's not ultimately what we're experiencing, but it is it's the representation.
Well, I have a good friend who says, I'm really glad that God got a hold of me before the church did.
Amen. And I've had people ask me, I've had the privilege of speaking on many panels about LGBTQ issues in the church and things like that. And people will say, do you get mad at God, about things? And I'm like, not really. The church, on the other hand, sure.
And not everyone. I mean, it's a human institution. We get that. And we're still serving God in it. And so we still believe in it. But, as he puts it in here, we're all sinners. We're all capable of great things. We're a mixed bag.
Exactly. And all, exactly. Again, he does it with such eloquence and such care. And I think he does it with great hope. That's the thing I really appreciate about his writing and about his ability. And again, watch it. I've since over the weekend watched a couple of his preaching clips because he's really kind of all over the place. He's really travels quite a bit preaching, and and again, the gift and the curse of technology is that when you get that kind of profile, once you're out there, you can see a lot of his preaching. But that is a consistent message, is about love and grace, and I'm just grateful for that.
And I think one of the most powerful parts of this chapter for me is that even though we sometimes wonder about the possibility of love really changing things, he that over and over reminds us that it does. And my favorite part of that chapter was if you minimize the power of love to change things, just look at the world as it is, and as Dr. Phil would say, how's that working for you?
Right, exactly.
I love that.
Yeah. No, and again, and his Bishop Curry's humanity and ability to laugh at himself, at the world, at those around him, it's profound. Well, as usual, it is time for us to draw to a close. And again, we're grateful for those who have joined us tonight or will via the archive. I'm grateful for our staff and all the support that they offer. And as we close, Bishop Curry references this passage, and it's one of my favorites, and I think also reflects so much of the spirit of actually of both chapters. So I just want to offer these words from the 12th chapter of Romans. Let love be genuine. Hate what is evil. Hold fast to what is good. Love one another with mutual affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. Do not lag in zeal. Be ardent in spirit. Serve the Lord. Rejoice in hope. Be patient in suffering. Persevere in prayer. Contribute to the needs of the saints. Extend hospitality to the strangers. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse them. Have a wonderful rest of your evening, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Good night.